For 52 years, an entire town called a dead boy a murderer. For 52 years, his family was driven out of their own hometown. His mother lit candles next to his photograph because there was no grave to visit. His little sister spent her entire life answering strangers who walked up to her and asked the same question over and over again. Did you ever find out what happened to your brother? And every single time, for 52 years, she had nothing to tell them. The answer was there the whole time, sitting in a cemetery in Brownstown, Indiana since December of 1971. Sitting in a coffin, in grave, right there in the town that spent half a century blaming him for something he never did. All someone had to do was count the bones. Welcome to Black Veil Crime Files. I am your narrator, and tonight we are pulling back the veil on one of the most heartbreaking, most infuriating, and most quietly devastating true crime stories in modern American history. A story that is not about a killer. It is about what happens when a community decides it needs someone to blame more than it needs the truth. And what that decision costs an innocent family for generations. If this is your first time here, hit that like button right now. Share this video with someone who needs to hear this story. And subscribe to Black Veil Crime Files with notifications turned on, because we cover every case like this one with the facts front and center and the victim always at the heart of it. This story deserves your full attention. So let us begin. The town, the boys, and the night that changed everything. Brownstown, Indiana. A town so small that if you blinked while driving through it, you would miss it entirely. The kind of place where everyone knew everyone. Where Friday nights meant high school football under the lights. Where families sat in the same pews every Sunday morning, and the biggest news of any given week was usually who bought a new truck or whose barn needed fixing after a storm. It was the kind of town where nothing ever really happened. And maybe that is exactly what made the night of December 17th, 1971 so impossible to process. Because something did happen that night. Something that would leave a wound in that community so deep, so raw, that 52 years later people still could not talk about it without their voices breaking. But before we get to that night, before we get to the fire, before we get to the moment that shattered 3 families and haunted an entire town for half a century, you need to understand who these boys were. Not as case numbers, not as names in a police report, as people, as sons, as brothers, as friends. Because what happened to them matters more when you understand what was taken. Jerry Autry was 19 years old, a senior at Brownstown Central High School. If you lived in Brownstown in 1971, you knew Jerry. Everyone did. He was the kid who lit up every room he walked into. Star football player. Popular. The kind of guy who could be friends with absolutely anyone. He had a longtime girlfriend. He drove a Ford Thunderbird convertible that turned heads on Main Street. Jerry was tall, over 6 feet, and he carried himself with the kind of easy confidence that comes from being well-liked and knowing it. He was 19 years old, and his whole life was ahead of him. Stanley Robinson. Stan to everyone who knew him. 17 years old. A little quieter than Jerry, but just as well-liked. His family owned a large rural farm just outside of Brownstown, and Stan had grown up on that land, knowing every inch of it. Stan and Jerry were close in the way that certain friendships get. The kind of close where you do not even need to make plans. You just show up and the other person is already there. Stan's older sister Gerda had been through a great deal already. Her first husband had died in a tragic accident on the family property earlier that same year, crushed when a car he was working underneath slipped off its jack. She had found him, and now, despite everything she had survived, she was getting married again. December 17th was supposed to be a celebration. The beginning of something new for Gerda. Instead, it became the beginning of something no one in that family would ever fully recover from. And then there was Mike. Mike Elsu, 16 years old, the youngest of the 3, quiet kid. Not as loud as Jerry, not as established as Stan, but he was their real friend, the kind who showed up when you needed him, who carried firewood without being asked, who rode shotgun at 2 in the morning just to keep you company. He had a younger sister named Linda who looked up to him the way younger sisters do. He was not just her brother. He was the person who made her feel safe in the world. She had absolutely no idea on that Friday night in December that she was about to lose him. that she would spend the next 52 years of her life not knowing whether he was alive or dead, that she would grow old waiting for an answer that refused to come. These three boys were best friends, and on the night of December 17th, 1971, they did what they always did. They hung out. Nothing unusual, nothing suspicious, just three teenagers in a small town looking for something to do on a Friday night. The evening started at a house party thrown by one of Jerry's friends. Music playing, people talking, the usual small-town Friday night scene. Around midnight, Jerry decided to take his girlfriend home. He told Stan and Mike he would catch up with them later. They said sure. They would meet at the cabin. The cabin. The cabin. This is where you need to pay close attention. Because this cabin, this tiny structure out on the Robinson family farm, is where everything leads. It was a place the boys had built together about 2 months earlier. Their hangout, their escape. They spent as many as 2 nights a week out there just talking and getting away from everything. It sat roughly a quarter mile from the Robinson family house at the edge of open farmland in a sparsely wooded area. To the boys, it was freedom. It was theirs. But here is what it actually was. 9 feet wide, 15 feet long, barely big enough to fit a car inside. The walls were built from old railroad ties, thick heavy beams of wood soaked in creosote, a tar-like preservative used to keep railroad wood from rotting. Creosote is effective for that purpose. It is also something else. It is extremely flammable. These were not just wooden walls. They were walls coated in a substance that under the right conditions burns fast, burns hot, and does not stop. The roof was sheet metal. There was one entrance. One single door to get in and out. There was one window, but it was not really a window. It was an unfinished opening on hinges, secured shut. Inside, the boys had put a couch, a rug, 2 small cots for sleeping, and a wood-burning stove. And somewhere in that 9 by 15 foot space, they also kept a Coleman lantern and a can of gasoline. Let that settle for a moment. A structure smaller than most bedrooms, built from creosote-soaked wood. One way in, one way out, a sealed window, a wood-burning stove, a can of gasoline. 3 teenage boys spending the night inside during one of the coldest nights of the year. Nobody thought twice about it. After Jerry dropped his girlfriend off, he headed to the Robinson farm where Stan and Mike were already there with 2 other teenagers. Stan's sister Gerda's reception was still going on at the American Legion building in town, so the boys drove in, grabbed some food and drinks, and around 2:30 in the morning headed back to the farm. Once they got back, Jerry realized he did not have his contact lens case. In 1971, contact lenses were not disposable. They were hard lenses. Expensive. You absolutely could not sleep in them. So he and Mike drove to Jerry's house in nearby Ewing, Indiana. Jerry's mother was home. Jerry stayed in the car while Mike ran inside to grab the case. A small detail. Quick errand. The kind of thing you would forget about by the next morning. They got the case and drove back to the cabin. Jerry parked the way he always did, with headlights pointing toward the entrance since the cabin had no outside lighting. Completely routine. Shortly after they got back, Mike briefly left with the 2 other friends, but around 2:45 in the morning Mike came back. One of the other teenagers helped him carry an armload of firewood to the cabin before saying goodnight and leaving. And that was it. The last time anyone outside that cabin saw any of those 3 boys alive. Mike Su, Jerry Autry,
Stan Robinson.
3 friends inside a 9 by 15 foot cabin in 12-degree weather. A wood stove burning. A can of gasoline nearby. Walls made of creosote-soaked railroad ties. They settled in for the night. 3 boys falling asleep the way teenagers do. Fast and deep. With no idea that they would never wake up. The morning, the ashes, and the impossible question. The next morning, Saturday, December 18th, Gerda Robinson made her way out to the cabin. The boys had promised to help her clean up after the wedding reception, and she was coming to collect them. She walked the quarter-mile path from the family house toward the edge of the farmland where the cabin stood. Where the cabin used to stand. When Gerda arrived, there was no cabin. Just a smoldering pile of ash. Twisted sheet metal. The charred remains of railroad ties scattered across the frozen ground. The structure had burned completely. The kind of complete destruction that only happens when everything inside a fire has something to feed on. The creosote, the gasoline, the lantern fuel, the rug, the couch, the wooden cots, all of it gone. She ran back to the house. The family called the authorities immediately. When police and investigators from the Indiana State Police arrived, what they found confirmed the worst. 2 sets of human remains. 2 bodies burned so badly, so thoroughly, that the official report described them as being close to incineration. The skulls were mostly cremated. The teeth, which are usually the last thing to be destroyed in a fire, were barely recognizable. The heat had been that intense. The creosote-soaked walls had turned that tiny cabin into something closer to a furnace than a building. Identification was nearly impossible, but investigators found 2 items in the debris, 2 class rings. The first was quickly identified as belonging to Jerry Autry, though multiple witnesses, including his own girlfriend, said he was not wearing it that night. The second was too damaged to confirm definitively as Stan's. Investigators also used a leg bone found on one of the cots, and because Jerry stood over 6 feet while Stan and Mike both stood 5 feet 8 inches, the longer bone was attributed to the taller boy. 2 boys identified. Case moving forward. But there was a massive, undeniable, impossible to ignore problem. There were supposed to be 3 boys in that cabin. 2 bodies were found. The deputy coroner examined the remains. The state pathologist was called in for a second opinion. Both independently came to the same conclusion. There was absolutely no possibility that a third person's remains were at the scene. 2 bodies. Only 2. 2 hours after investigators left the scene, the Sue family reported Mike missing. He had not come home. He had not called. No one had seen him. No one had heard from him. And from that moment forward, no one ever would. Mike Sue, 16 years old, simply vanished. Not from a city or a highway or some dangerous situation where disappearance might make sense. He vanished from a cabin on his friend's family farm on a freezing December night when he was supposed to be sleeping next to the 2 people who knew him best in the world. 3 boys went into that cabin. Only 2 were found. So where was Mike Sue? The evidence nobody followed. Like and share this video right now, because what comes next is where this case gets deeply disturbing. The search began immediately. Dozens of people from Brownstown fanned out across the farmland, the tree lines, the banks of the White River, the woods, the fields, the ditches along State Road 135. Volunteers, neighbors, friends of the family, people who had known Mike since he was a baby. They looked everywhere. They looked for days. They found nothing. But the physical evidence at the scene told a story that investigators seemed unwilling to follow to its conclusion. Start with Jerry's car. The boys who had left the cabin around 2:45 in the morning were clear. The Thunderbird was in its usual spot, headlights facing the cabin entrance, exactly where Jerry always parked it. But when investigators arrived the next morning, the car had been moved to the opposite side of the cabin. No fire damage, no smoke damage, completely untouched by the blaze. But the oil pan on the underside was cracked clean in 2 as though the car had been driven hard over rough, uneven ground. The keys were still in the ignition turned to the on position. And the driver's seat had been adjusted. Jerry Autry was over 6 feet tall and always pushed the seat all the way back. But when investigators found the car, the seat was pulled nearly all the way forward, as if someone considerably shorter than Jerry had been the last person to drive it. Someone like a 16-year-old boy who stood 5 feet 8. Then there was the comforter. Out in the open field away from the cabin, investigators found a partially burned comforter just lying there at the edge of the farmland. Near it a pack of cigarettes and several fresh cigarette butts, as though someone had stood there for a while watching or panicking. The comforter had not been there when the boys left the cabin at 2:45. So sometime between 2:45 and sunrise someone had taken it from the cabin, carried it to the field, and left it there. And then there was Mike's belt buckle, found right there in the cabin debris among the ashes. A belt belonging to Michael Sue in the very place where 2 boys had burned. And yet both the coroner and the pathologist said with certainty there were only 2 bodies, not 3. His belt buckle was there, but he was not. A 16-year-old boy in 12-degree weather. No car, no phone, wearing cabin clothes on a winter night, had apparently just walked away into the frozen Indiana darkness. That was the official position, and in the absence of a better answer, something worse filled the vacuum. What a small town does when it needs someone to blame. It started as whispers, in the grocery store, at church on Sunday morning, conversations that stopped when certain people walked into a room. And then it grew, and it spread, and it took on a life of its own the way only small-town gossip can, feeding on itself, getting louder and uglier with every telling. People started saying Mike Sue had set the fire, that he had killed Jerry and Stan and then run away. A 16-year-old boy, they decided, had murdered his two best friends and vanished into the night. No evidence, no motive, no logic. Just the simple, cruel arithmetic of a small community trying to make sense of something senseless. Two boys were dead. One boy was missing. And the easiest story, the one requiring the least thinking, was that the missing one must have done it. The rumors got darker. People said Mike had been getting into drugs. The local newspapers ran with it not as verified reporting but as the kind of speculative coverage that plants seeds and lets them grow into something poisonous. And those seeds grew right into the heart of the Sue family. Think about that for a moment. You are the Sue family. Your son is gone. You do not know if he is alive or dead. You cannot find him. The police cannot find him. And instead of sympathy, instead of your community wrapping its arms around you the way small towns are supposed to, you are accused. Your missing 16-year-old child who might be lying dead somewhere in the cold is called a murderer. In the streets, in the stores, in the newspaper, to your face. Linda Pack was Mike's younger sister. She was a child when this happened. And from that moment forward her life was defined by a question she could not answer and an accusation she could not fight. For 50 years people approached her and asked the same thing. Did you ever find out what happened to your brother? Every single time. And every single time she had nothing to tell them. Mike's sisters eventually left Brownstown. They had to. The weight of the suspicion, the constant whispers, the way people looked at them. It was too much. Linda would later say in her own words that the community pretty much ran them out of town. The family went to court and requested that Mike be declared legally dead. They wanted to grieve him properly, to hold a funeral, to put his name on a headstone, to have somewhere to bring flowers. The court said no. Without proof of death, the request was denied. The community called him a murderer who ran away. The court said he was not dead because there was no body. And the family was stuck in between, unable to mourn, unable to move on, unable to fight back against accusations they knew were false but could never disprove. There was no funeral for Mike Sue. No burial. No grave. His mother took a photograph of her son and placed it somewhere in the house. She lit candles beside it. And that was all they had. A photo, some candles, a memorial plaque with nothing underneath it. Just a name on a piece of metal reminding the world a boy had existed and then stopped existing and nobody could explain why. Linda Pack would later say simply and quietly that they just had to learn to live with it. And those 10 words carry 50 years of weight inside them. 50 years of Christmas mornings with an empty chair. 50 years of birthdays for a boy who was forever 16. 50 years of people whispering behind your back. 50 years of not knowing. 52 years later, someone finally said yes. The 1970s became the 80s. The 80s became the 90s. The 90s became the 2000s. And still nothing. Just silence and cold case files gathering dust in a cabinet somewhere in the Jackson County Sheriff's Office. All three families pushed for a grand jury investigation multiple times. Without concrete evidence, their requests were denied. Every time. And then in 2022 something changed. Nancy Sterling, Stan Robinson's sister, and Cher Fletcher, Jerry Autry's sister, had tried before. Each time a new sheriff took office, they reached out hoping that maybe this one would listen. Until Nancy walked into the office of Sheriff Rick Meyer. And for the first time in half a century, someone said yes. Sheriff Meyer assigned the case to Lieutenant Adam Nicholson. Nicholson was young enough that the fire had happened before he was born. He had no personal memory of it. No bias. No preconceived notions. But he had a connection. His mother had been best friends with one of Mike Sue's older sisters. He had grown up hearing about this case as a son, listening to his mother talk about a family that had never stopped hurting. When he got the assignment, he carried that with him. Nicholson went back to the beginning. He pulled the original Indiana State Police reports. He read every word. And the more he read, the more one thought kept returning. A thought so obvious, so logical, that it was almost hard to believe no one had acted on it in 51 years. Mike Sue was 16 years old. If he had run away from that fire and walked into a new life, then where was he? 51 years is a long time. People surface. People use their names and their social security numbers. They show up in records somewhere. But Mike Sue had never appeared anywhere. Not once in 51 years. No record.
No trace.
No sign of life. The simplest explanation, requiring the fewest assumptions, was that Mike Sue had not run away at all. He had been there the whole time. Nicholson decided to exhume the remains of Jerry Autry and Stanley Robinson and have them examined by modern forensic experts to find out once and for all whether 2 boys or 3 had died in that cabin. He reached out to Dr. Krista Lom, a board-certified forensic anthropologist and professor at the University of Indianapolis. She agreed to help. The families gave their consent. They provided their DNA. And for the first time in 51 years, the earth above those graves was about to be disturbed. Fairview Cemetery. The morning everything changed. Fairview Cemetery, Brownstown, Indiana. June 21st, 2022. A Monday morning. Summer heat settling over the flat Indiana landscape. The quiet hum of a small town going about its ordinary business. But on this particular Monday, in this particular cemetery, someone was finally going back for Mike Sue. 2 graves side by side. Jerry Autry and Stanley Robinson. Buried here since December of 1971. Laid to rest on the same day in the same cemetery by families too broken to do anything but hold each other. These graves had sat undisturbed for over half a century. 51 winters. 51 springs. And through all of it, whatever was inside those coffins had remained exactly as it was. Untouched. Unexamined. Unquestioned. Until now. Dr. Lom stood at the site with her team from the University of Indianapolis Human Identification Center. The families had given their consent and their DNA. The ground was opened. The coffins were lifted. 2 caskets, 51 years old, brought up from the earth and into the light for the first time since they were lowered in. Dr. Lom transported the remains to the Human Identification Center, and then began the part nobody talks about in these stories. The waiting. For Linda Pack, the waiting was nothing new. She had been waiting her entire adult life. 51 years of not knowing. 51 years of holidays with an empty space at the table. 51 years of waking up in the middle of the night with the same question and the same unbearable silence where an answer should have been. She had waited as a child, as a teenager, as a young woman, as a middle-aged woman, and now as an older woman looking back at a lifetime shaped entirely by one night in December of 1971. She knew how to wait. She had been doing it longer than most people had been alive. But this time there was something at the other end of the waiting. A real, tangible scientific possibility that the answer was finally coming. The bones do not lie. Months passed. Summer turned to fall. Fall turned to early winter. And then on November 22, 2022, 5 months after the exhumation, Dr. Krista Lom completed her analysis. And her findings changed everything. Inside those 2 coffins, Dr. Lom did not find the remains of 2 people. She found 3. Here is how she knew. When a forensic anthropologist examines skeletal remains, one of the most fundamental things they do is count bones. Because every human being has the same set. 1 skull, 1 left femur, 1 right femur, 206 bones total. When you open 2 coffins supposed to contain 2 people, you should find at most 2 of any given bone. 2 left femurs, 2 right tibias, 2 of each. That is basic anatomy. That is mathematics. That is fact. But Dr. Lom did not find 2 of certain bones. She found 3 triplicate copies. 3 copies of bones that only exist once in a single human body. There is no interpretation required. There is no ambiguity. If you have 3 left femurs, you have 3 people. Period. It is not a theory. It is not an opinion. It is scientific certainty. Dr. Lam's report stated exactly that. A minimum of 3 individuals were represented within those 2 caskets. Mike Sue had been there the entire time. 52 years he had been right there in Fairview Cemetery in Brownstown. The town he grew up in. The town his family was driven out of. The town that called him a murderer and a runaway and a coward. He was there the whole time, lying in a coffin next to his best friends. His bones mixed with theirs, buried, unidentified, uncounted, forgotten by the very investigators who were supposed to find him. He never ran away. He never fled into the night. He never set a fire. He never hurt anyone. He was a 16-year-old boy who fell asleep in a cabin with his 2 best friends on a freezing December night and never woke up. A boy went to sleep. A fire took him, just like it took Jerry, just like it took Stan. The only difference is that someone counted wrong. Someone looked at those ashes in 1971 and said 2 bodies. And because they said it with enough authority, everyone believed them for 52 years. And because of that single mistake, a 16-year-old boy was erased from his own death. Denied a funeral.
Dinaida grave.
Denied the simple basic dignity of being acknowledged as someone who had died. And in the vacuum left by that denial, the worst of human nature filled the space. The call that changed everything. After the bone analysis confirmed 3 individuals, the next step was DNA. Dr. Lam submitted the least damaged bones to the Indiana State Police lab. Most came back with no usable result. The fire had been too hot, the creosote too thorough, but 1 bone held. On June 12, 2023, the Indiana State Police lab completed its analysis. The DNA belonged to Stanley Robinson. Stan was now positively, scientifically, undeniably identified after 52 years. For Mike and Jerry, the DNA was not recoverable. But here is the thing. It did not matter, because the bone count was the answer. 3 people. 3 sets of remains in 2 coffins supposed to hold only 2. There was no other explanation. Mike Sue died in that cabin on December 18, 1971, alongside Jerry Autry and Stanley Robinson. And the evidence had been sitting in Fairview Cemetery for 52 years waiting for someone to count the bones. Lieutenant Adam Nicholson made the call. He called Linda Pack, Mike Sue's little sister, the woman who had spent her entire life carrying a weight that no person should ever have to carry. He told her what they had found, that her brother had been there all along, that Mike had died with his friends, that he had not run, that he had not hurt anyone, that he had been in that cemetery in those coffins for 52 years. Nicholson later said it was hard to explain what that moment felt like. Giving someone information that is life-changing about something that happened before he was even born. He said it was a great feeling knowing the family finally had the answers they had been wanting for more than half a century. And Linda Pack, who had waited 52 years, who had been questioned and accused and pitted and ignored, who had lit candles next to a photograph and visited a memorial plaque with nothing underneath it, who had learned to live with it because there was no other choice. She said she did not even know how to put it into words. Unbelievable, she said. Happy. A bunch of emotions all at once. 52 years of pain released in a single phone call. A lifetime of not knowing answered in a single sentence. He was there. He was always there. Sure Fletcher, Jerry's sister, said something after the findings were announced that cuts right to the heart of everything this case was, and everything it should never have become. She said that now all 3 families finally knew what happened at that cabin. And what happened was simply a tragedy. Not a conspiracy. Not a crime. Not a mystery. Just 3 boys. Cold night. And a fire. That is all it ever was. But it took 52 years for anyone to prove it. 52 years during which a 16-year-old boy was called a killer by people who never knew him. 52 years during which his family was driven from their hometown. 52 years during which his mother could only light candles next to his picture because there was no grave to visit. 52 years during which the technology to count bones had been available and was a standard forensic method. But no one bothered to apply it because in 1971 a coroner said 2 bodies and everyone took his word for it. Linda Pack, when asked how she felt after all that pain and all that waiting, said one thing that will stay with you long after the story ends. She said it simply and quietly with the kind of calm that only comes from someone who has carried something impossibly heavy for an impossibly long time and has finally been allowed to set it down. She said, "I am just glad I got to be alive long enough to know the truth." Mike Sue was 16 years old. He liked hanging out with his friends. He carried firewood without being asked. He rode shotgun on late-night drives just to keep you company. He was somebody's son, somebody's brother, somebody's best friend. And for 52 years the world turned him into a rumor, a suspect, a ghost. But he was not any of those things. He was a boy who fell asleep next to his best friends on a cold December night and never woke up. And he was right there the whole time, waiting for someone to find him, waiting for someone to count the bones, waiting for someone to say his name, not as an accusation, but as what it always should have been. A boy who was loved, a boy who was lost, and a boy who after 52 years finally came home. Before you go, think about this. If the investigators in 1971 had simply counted the bones properly, taken one more day, asked one more question, looked just a little bit closer, would the Sue family have been spared 52 years of pain? And how many other cases right now today are sitting in filing cabinets somewhere with the answer right there inside them waiting for someone to finally look? Leave a comment below and tell me what part of the story hit you the hardest. And do you think the original investigators should be held accountable for what their mistake cost this family? Because 52 years is a long time to wait for the truth, especially when the truth was there all along. If this video moved you, please like it, share it, and subscribe to Black Veil Crime Files. We do not cover these stories for the numbers. We cover them because someone has to say the names the world forgot. And on this channel, those names are never forgotten. This is Black Veil Crime Files. I will see you in the next one. Black Heart.